Hi folks, welcome to Module 1 of Christian Worldview. In this module, we're going to talk about the concept of worldview itself. This is a very useful concept, a very useful way of thinking about our faith. It allows us to take the broadest possible view and look at how everything fits together. So a Christian worldview is another way that you might put this, is a kind of Christian philosophy. The definitive Christian work on worldview, and particularly the history of the worldview as a concept, is David Naugle's work. Naugle says, conceiving of Christianity as a worldview has been one of the most significant developments in the history of the church. The word worldview initially came from the German word Weltanschauung, and it denotes the widest view which the mind can take of things in an effort to grasp them together as a whole from the standpoint of some particular philosophy or theology. In this case, of course, a Christian philosophy or theology. James Orr says, he who with his whole heart believes in Jesus as the Son of God is thereby committed to much else besides. He is committed to a view of God, to a view of man, to a view of sin, to a view of redemption, to a view of human destiny found only in Christianity. This forms a Weltanschauung, or Christian view of the world, which stands in marked contrast with theories wrought out from a purely philosophical or scientific standpoint. So what are the causes that lead to the formation of worldviews? James Orr again says the answer lies deep within human nature and its native capacities for thinking and acting. Theoretically, the human mind is not satisfied with piecemeal knowledge, but seeks integrity in its understanding of reality. Worldviews are generated by the mind's aspiration to a unified comprehension of the universe, drawing together facts, laws, generalizations, and answers to ultimate questions. Even behind the agnostic's refusal to define the universe, there lurks still a unifying theory of reality, what has been referred to as an unconscious metaphysic. Worldviews are generated by the mind's quest for a framework to orient people to the world around them and to the ultimate issues of life. On the one hand, there is an aversion to metaphysics, but on the other hand, there is this need for meaning. So someone might have a real aversion to, putting things together, really thinking deliberately about any kind of big picture. And yet, at the same time, there is this real need that people have for a sense of meaning. And so there's an automatic sense in which we do actually put things together, even as a subconscious, at a subconscious level, into a worldview. Gordon H. Clark says, Christianity therefore has, or one may even say Christianity is, a comprehensive view of all things. It takes the world, both material and spiritual, to be an ordered system. Consequently, if Christianity is to be defended against the objections of other philosophies, the only adequate method will be comprehensive. While it is of great importance to defend particular points of interest, these specific points will be insufficient. In addition to these details, there is also needed a picture of the whole into which they fit. The Christian philosopher Hermann Dooyeweerd argued that all human endeavour stems not actually from a worldview initially, but actually from the spiritual commitments of the heart. He says at the basis of philosophy and theory, there actually is no historical pluralism of worldviews, but actually only two religious ground motives that are in antithetical opposition. There's man converted to God versus man averted from God. This is decisive for all life and thought. So there's basically these two commitments. It's commitment to autonomy anti-God autonomy, sort of playing God, the God complex, or the motivation that comes from worship. Worldviews, Doyeved argues, are actually not the most deeply rooted thing in the soil of the heart. Rather, religion or faith is. The religion of the heart is the cause. The philosophies and worldviews are the cognitive effect. Well, let's have a very brief look then at the origins of worldview philosophy. And again, this is going to be fairly brief, and it's Naugel's exploration of this that is really, as I said, the definitive account of the historical development of worldviews. The first use of Weltanschauung is actually in the philosophy Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant is famous for pointing out the fact that we don't receive our impressions of reality directly, but rather the mind is an active organism that shapes those impressions of the world in accordance with itself. The mind has a particular shape, and it shapes the external world in accordance with the shape of the mind. So, for example, Immanuel Kant even argued that even space and time are features of the mind rather than features of reality in itself, and we organize those impressions within the categories of space and time, and within our own sort of logical categories, right? But reality as it is, we don't really know. We only know reality through the lens of the mind. So he says our intuition of the world is the substrate underlying what is mere appearance. For Hegel, Weltanschauung, worldview, means the worldview of a certain nation at a certain time. So Hegel had this idea that all of reality he was a kind of pantheist, you would refer to as a panentheist. We'll have a look at Hegel's panentheism in a future session. But he had this idea that all of reality is sort of the unfolding mind of God, and various times in history and various societies sort of express and he's the originator of the idea of the spirit of the age. So he says a worldview is a general shared view which one acquires automatically by participation in the times and society which one forms with one's fellows. It is the understanding from apprehending the unfolding of spirit in the exterior world. So as I said, it's the spirit of the age. A worldview is like you just kind of absorb it as a member of your particular time and place, and you absorb this worldview, and which he understands as, I said, the spirit of the age. Søren Kierkegaard, he argues that a life view consists not in an understanding of everything, but rather supplies the key, a kind of framework or outline by which all things can indeed be understood. So for Kierkegaard, you have to begin with faith, and you begin with your with that subjective standpoint, kind of getting fixed in a way. There's a radical work of redemption that is required for the human mind to be able to have our standpoint, our lens, mended in a way in order that we can see things the way that they really are. So no one can really know the truth unless they have the right sort of subjective condition. So Kierkegaard famously says truth is subjectivity, meaning that we have to become true in ourselves. We have to be redeemed, and our hearts have to be regenerated. In a way, our lens through which we see the world has to be fixed, and then we can apprehend truth. To satisfy the innate need for an understanding of human existence, the philosopher Dilthey proposes a doctrine of worldviews. and he's a very famous worldview philosopher, definitely furthered this idea of worldview. And he attempts to steer a middle course between what, in his time was becoming kind of defunct metaphysical absolutism and the nihilism of historical relativism. He thinks that we can naturally piece the experiences of life together into a coherent worldview. So he argues that if the meaning of life is to be grasped in the form of a worldview, then it must begin with the initial recognition that the ultimate root of any worldview is life itself. Despite the fact that life is experienced differently in each individual, the immutability of human existence guarantees that the fundamental features of life's experience are common to all men. So there's just certain things that we all go through that causes us to piece together a coherent worldview. So this is how he tries to steer a middle course between, a sort of metaphysical absolutism, like here's the answer, this is the big picture, bang, there you are, and the sort of nihilism of historical relativism, well, everyone has their own truth and so forth. He says, no, there is a kind of an absolute, and that is that just the human experience as such. And so given that we all have this common experience, we form worldviews. Perhaps different societies form worldviews, but yes, there is something beyond that about that all humanity shares, and so we can sort of converse. There is something in common. We perhaps innately have this kind of common way of viewing the world. So there is something shared by all mankind there. For example, the certainty of death, the cruelty of natural process, general transitoriness, plus a myriad of other factors have prompted a quest in minds past and present to penetrate these unfathomable mysteries. Worldviews, therefore, are an attempt to solve the riddle of life. Dilthey argues that out of the whirlwind of experience, human beings form attitudes towards life and the world by necessity, and eventually universal attitudes or moods are established. He says worldviews develop under different conditions, climates, races, nationalities, determined by history and through political organisation, the time-bound confines of epochs and eras. Well, if this was true in Dilthey's day, so much the more now. We face a situation in which we encounter a multiplicity of worldviews, even within the one society. From such a relationship to the invisible, Dilthey says, there emerge the interpretation of reality, the appraisal of life, and the ideal of practical conduct. All of them are contained in parabolic speech and in doctrines of faith. They rest on a whole order of life. They develop in prayer and meditation. From the outset, all these worldviews harbour in themselves a conflict of beneficent and evil beings, of an existence according to the understanding of our senses, and of a higher world transcending the senses. So Dilthey is talking about sort of the history of how worldviews actually come about. Of course, this isn't a Christian account. From a Christian point of view, we would argue that a little bit differently, agreeing a little bit more with Doyeved, who would argue that we form a worldview based out of our that a non-Christian forms a worldview as a way of even subconsciously of shutting God out in a sense. But of course, Dilthey is looking for a sort of a naturalistic explanation of how people form their worldviews, how these worldviews come together in different ways in societies, but how there is also a sense, overlapping elements of all the different worldviews. Dilthey then identifies three main ways in which we acquire our worldview. And he's going to speak of 3 different kinds of worldviews, but what he means is really ways in which worldviews are formed. So first of all, there's the religious way, and this is where a worldview is formed by the authority of a certain religious hierarchy who, in his view, who then disseminate that worldview based on a sense of confidence in a certain revelation. Okay, so there's a claim here that there's a outside in, that this is revealed in some way. So that's the first way that he sees that worldviews are formed from his, sort of secular and historical point of view. And then he speaks of poetic worldviews because he recognizes that literature, imaginative literature, and by poetry doesn't mean literally, like poetic verse. By poetic worldviews, he's talking specifically about literature, and we might add in our time, we might add film as well as probably as the most dominant ways in which a worldview is formed. So in Dilthey's time, it was particularly literature. People would read books, and through the appeal to the imagination, people would form a worldview by entering into the world created by the author, or in our case, by the filmmaker. And so they would acquire this worldview in that way. Now, in a way, all of these can work together. See, religion can, in a sense, lay a foundation. And poetry, literature can provide an expression for a worldview. So there's a kind of cumulative thing here as well. We sort of move from religion to poetry. But ultimately, Dilthey thinks we move to a metaphysical worldview. And it is, as he says, the will to acquire a universally true knowledge which gives a unique structure to this new form of worldview. Now, that's a quote. So ultimately, we want to achieve a sort of rationally coherent account, and this is where we take the philosophical approach and we form a coherent metaphysical worldview. Now, of metaphysical worldviews, he identifies 3 different types here within this subset. There is subjective idealism, in which the mind is primary. This was in Plato, Aristotle. This is particularly where you see a sort of innate knowledge at work. And we saw that in Kant as well. Kant argues that the shape of the mind determines the way that we're going to sort of receive the impressions of reality. So this is the subjective standpoint. Subjective idealism makes the mind primary. And then there's objective idealism, which says basically that nature is mind. And in a way we share in a sort of a universal mind. This was true of the Stoics, true of the philosopher Spinoza, and also Hegel. And we're gonna look at Stoicism, Spinoza, and Hegel when we turn to comparative worldviews. And then there's naturalism, where nature is primary, and this is one that should be familiar to us, where we just, it's through scientific method we look at the world, and it's the instruments of science that we use to put together a worldview, and this is known as a positivistic way of constructing a worldview. So that's just a very brief overview of worldview philosophy, and as I said, there's a longer account of that in Naugel's book, but just wanted to give you a taste of worldview philosophy as such. In the next session, we're going to talk about worldview formation.